The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the mahogany table as Elena Martinez balanced 3 plates along her forearm, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. The private dining room at Le Bernardin hummed with the kind of quiet wealth that whispered rather than shouted, until Marcus Blackwell's voice cut through it like a blade through silk. "Excuse me, waitress," he drawled, not bothering to look up from his phone. "This salmon is overcooked. I specifically requested medium rare, and it looks like I spent the afternoon in the desert." His friends, equally polished, equally dismissive, chuckled at his performance. "Perhaps you should stick to serving at Applebee's, where standards are more accommodating to your skill level." Elena's grip tightened imperceptibly on the plates. She'd served presidents and foreign dignitaries in this very room, had earned her sommelier certification while working nights to put herself through hospitality management, had built a reputation for grace under pressure that made her one of the most requested servers at Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. But Marcus Blackwell, 24 years old, with his father's angular jaw and his mother's cold blue eyes, saw only the uniform, only the service. "I'll have the kitchen prepare a new dish immediately, sir," Elena replied, her voice steady as mountain stone. "Chef Laurent personally selects each cut. Perhaps we could discuss the temperature preference you'd prefer for the replacement." Marcus finally looked up, his gaze traveling over her with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to viewing people as objects. "What I'd prefer is competent service. But since that seems beyond your capabilities, just bring me the steak instead. And try not to ruin that, too." He turned to his companions. "This is exactly why Father insists on dining at his club. At least there the help knows their place." If you're enjoying this story of unexpected revenge and want to see how Elena handles this situation, this is going to take some time to unfold, so smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories like this one. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Elena felt the familiar burn of injustice in her chest, the same fire that had driven her through 18-hour days cleaning office buildings to pay for her mother's chemotherapy, through nights studying for her hospitality degree while her feet bled in second-hand shoes, through the grinding years of building herself from nothing into something that mattered. But she'd learned long ago that dignity was not a luxury she could afford to lose, no matter how others tried to strip it from her. So she smiled. Not the practiced smile of service, but something smaller, more real, touched with a knowledge that Marcus Blackwell couldn't even begin to fathom. "Of course, sir. The steak will be out shortly." She collected his plate with steady hands, noting the way his friends watched her with varying degrees of discomfort. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes and designer clothes that fit too well to be anything but custom, mouthed sorry when Marcus looked away. As Elena moved toward the kitchen, she heard Marcus continue his performance. "It's honestly tragic how standards have declined. My father built his fortune on understanding that excellence comes from surrounding yourself with excellence, not settling for mediocrity in ill-fitting uniforms." The kitchen doors swung shut behind her like a curtain falling on Act 1. Chef Laurent looked up from his station, his weathered face creased with concern. "Elena, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," she murmured, setting down the barely touched salmon that had been perfectly prepared, as everything in Chef Laurent's kitchen always was. "Just a reminder of why some people need to be taught rather than told." "Ah," Laurent nodded knowingly. He'd worked in kitchens for 40 years, had seen every type of customer, from oil sheiks to old money aristocrats. "The young Blackwell, oui?" I heard his voice carry. "The apple does not fall far from the tree, but sometimes she rolls further than expected." Elena's phone buzzed against her hip, a text message that made her smile properly for the first time that evening. The kind of smile that could launch ships or topple kingdoms, depending on the observer's perspective. She glanced at the clock. In exactly 17 minutes, the real show would begin. "Chef," she said, untying her apron with deliberate care, "could you ask Marie to cover table 7 for the rest of the evening? Something tells me the dynamic is about to change rather dramatically." Laurent raised an eyebrow, but nodded. He'd learned to trust Elena's instincts over the past 3 years. She had a way of reading situations, of understanding the currents that ran beneath the surface of human interaction. It made her exceptional at her job, but more than that, it made her formidable. Elena slipped through the staff corridors to the employee break room, where her reflection stared back at her from the small mirror above the sink. 36 years old, with the kind of natural beauty that makeup could enhance but never create. High cheekbones that spoke of her Castilian grandmother. Dark eyes that had seen both the depths of struggle and the heights of determination. Hair the color of rich coffee beans that she wore pulled back in a simple twist that somehow managed to look elegant despite its practicality. She reached into her locker and withdrew a small leather portfolio, running her fingers over its smooth surface. Inside were documents that would reshape the evening's narrative entirely. Legal papers, signed just that morning in the offices of Blackwell Industries' most trusted attorneys. She thought of the conversation that had led to this moment, the months of careful courtship and growing love that had blossomed between herself and a man who had seen her not as a server, but as an equal, a partner, a woman worthy of his respect and his heart. The irony was exquisite, really. Marcus Blackwell had spent the evening demonstrating exactly why his father had fallen in love with someone who understood the value of hard work, of treating every person with dignity regardless of their station. Charles Blackwell, 62 years old, widowed for 3 years, carrying the weight of building a financial empire while raising a son who had never learned that money was a tool, not a measure of worth, had found in Elena something his own son seemed incapable of recognizing in anyone. Elena's phone buzzed again. This time it was Charles himself. "Just pulled into the valet area. Are you ready for this, my love?" She typed back quickly. "More than ready. Your son has been quite educational this evening." "I was afraid of that. Some lessons can only be learned through experience, I'm afraid." Elena tucked the phone away and smoothed her uniform one final time. In a few minutes, she would change clothes, transform from server to something else entirely. But for now, she wanted Marcus to see her exactly as she was, a working woman who had earned every dollar through sweat and skill, who had built herself from nothing into something remarkable, and who would soon be in a position to teach him that respect was not a gift to be given sparingly, but a basic human right to be shared universally. Before Elena could answer, the dining room doors opened with the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention. Charles Blackwell entered like the king of his own castle, his silver hair perfectly styled, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection, his presence filling the space in a way that made everyone sit a little straighter. Behind him walked James Morrison, the family's longtime attorney, carrying a briefcase that seemed suddenly ominous in the intimate setting. Charles's eyes found Elena immediately, and his face transformed with a smile that was both tender and proud. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said, nodding to the table, "I hope you'll forgive the interruption, but I have some rather significant news to share." Marcus had gone completely still, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine fear. "Father, what are you doing here? And why is the waitress still—" "Elena," Charles said, crossing to her side with the kind of natural grace that spoke of decades in boardrooms and social settings. Well, not tonight, anyway. He took her hand in his, the gesture both intimate and declarative. "Tonight, she's my fiancée. As of this morning, she's also my wife. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquakes, the held breath before the world reshapes itself entirely. Elena watched Marcus's face as understanding dawned, as the evening's events realigned themselves into a pattern he had never seen coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles continued, his voice carrying the warmth of a man who had found happiness late in life and intended to savor every moment. "I'd like you to meet Elena Blackwell, my wife, and your new stepmother, Marcus." Le Bernardin had been her proving ground, the place where she transformed from someone who served food into someone who crafted experiences. Chef Laurent had taken her under his wing during her first week, teaching her not just which fork went where, but how to read the rhythm of a kitchen, how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, how to be present without being intrusive. Service, he had told her in his thick French accent while they prepared for another busy evening, is not about being invisible. It is about being so attuned to others' needs that your presence enhances their experience rather than disrupting it. You must become like water, fluid, adaptable, essential, but never overwhelming. Elena had taken that lesson to heart, developing an almost supernatural ability to move through dining rooms like a dancer, to appear at tables at exactly the right moment with exactly what was needed. She learned wine pairings not from books, but from watching reactions, from seeing how a particular vintage could transform someone's entire evening. She studied the subtle art of managing difficult customers without confrontation, of diffusing tension with a perfectly timed joke or a genuinely empathetic response to frustration. But the real education came from observing the vast spectrum of human behavior that wealth could either reveal or conceal. She had served titans of industry who treated busboys with the same respect they showed board members, and she had served spoiled children in adult bodies who seemed to derive pleasure from making others uncomfortable. She had watched marriages dissolve over dessert courses, had been present for business deals that shaped industries, had served meals that celebrated life's greatest triumphs and comforted its deepest sorrows. The night she first met Charles Blackwell had been like any other, except for the way he had looked at her, not through her, not around her, but directly at her, as if she were a person worthy of his full attention rather than simply a component of the evening service. He had been dining alone, which was unusual for someone of his status, reading what appeared to be a novel rather than business documents or industry reports. "Excuse me," he had said as she refilled his water glass, "but I couldn't help noticing that you knew exactly which wine would complement the bouillabaisse without consulting the sommelier. That's quite impressive." Elena had paused, caught off guard by the genuine curiosity in his voice. "I've been studying wines for several years, sir. It helps me provide better recommendations to guests." "Studying on your own time, I assume?" "Yes, sir. I'm working toward my sommelier certification." Charles had set down his book. She had glimpsed the title, something by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and given him his complete attention. "That's admirable. Most people in service industries are content to learn only what's required for their immediate job. You're clearly thinking beyond the present moment." The conversation had lasted only a few minutes, but Elena had sensed something different about Charles Blackwell. Unlike the customers who spoke to her as if she were a recording device, he seemed genuinely interested in her responses. Unlike those who treated servers as objects to be manipulated or impressed, he spoke to her as an equal, someone whose thoughts and experiences might actually be valuable. That had been 8 months ago. What followed was a courtship so gradual and respectful that Elena sometimes wondered if she was imagining the growing connection between them. Charles began requesting her section when he dined at Le Bernardin, their brief conversations expanding from wine recommendations to discussions of books, travel, philosophy, and the peculiar challenges of building a life in a city that could simultaneously be nurturing and ruthless. Elena discovered that Charles Blackwell, despite his wealth and status, was fundamentally lonely. His wife had died 3 years earlier from the same cancer that had taken Elena's mother, leaving him to navigate not only his own grief, but the challenge of relating to a son who seemed to view the world as a place that existed solely for his convenience. Charles spoke about Marcus with the particular pain of a parent who loved deeply but felt helpless to guide someone who refused to be guided. "I've given him everything," Charles had confided during one of their longer conversations when the restaurant was quiet and Elena had a rare moment to sit with him over coffee. "But I'm beginning to think that was exactly the problem. How do you teach someone the value of struggle when you've protected them from ever experiencing it? How do you instill empathy in someone who has never needed to depend on anyone else's kindness?" Elena had thought of her own mother, of the lessons learned through necessity rather than choice, of the way hardship could either embitter or ennoble, depending on how it was framed and processed. "Maybe," she had suggested, "the lesson isn't something you can give him. Maybe it's something he has to discover for himself." "And what if he never does?" "Then at least you'll know you tried to show him a better way. Sometimes the best thing we can do for people we love is model the behavior we hope to see, even if they're not ready to recognize it." Their relationship had deepened slowly, built on respect and genuine compatibility rather than passion or convenience. Charles was 15 years older than Elena, but he had never made her feel that the gap was anything more than a number. He valued her opinions, sought her advice on everything from business strategies to personal relationships, introduced her to his social circles not as an accessory, but as an equal partner whose insights were worth hearing. Elena had never expected to fall in love with a billionaire. She had assumed that such relationships existed only in romance novels and fairy tales, that the gap between extreme wealth and working-class struggles was too vast to bridge with genuine understanding. But Charles had proven her wrong by never trying to rescue her from her circumstances, never suggesting that her work was beneath her or that she needed saving from her life. Instead, he had celebrated her accomplishments, supported her goals, and made it clear that he wanted to be with her, not despite her background, but because of who that background had shaped her to become. The proposal had been private, intimate, delivered over dinner at a small restaurant in the West Village where they could be simply Charles and Elena rather than a billionaire and his server girlfriend. No cameras, no social media announcements, no grand gestures designed for public consumption. Just two people who had found in each other the kind of partnership that made the world seem suddenly full of possibilities. "I want to marry you," Charles had said simply. "Not because I need someone to fill an empty space in my life, but because you make me remember what it feels like to be genuinely happy. You make me want to be better than I am." Elena had said yes not because of the security he offered, not because of the dramatic change in circumstances that marriage would bring, but because she had discovered in Charles Blackwell a man who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. Someone who understood that strength could be quiet, that intelligence came in many forms, that dignity was not a luxury, but a birthright that everyone deserved to claim. The proposal had been private, intimate, delivered over dinner at a small restaurant in the West Village where they could be simply Charles and Elena rather than a billionaire and his server girlfriend. No cameras, no social media announcements, no grand gestures designed for public consumption. Just two people who had found in each other the kind of partnership that made the world seem suddenly full of possibilities. "I want to marry you," Charles had said simply. "Not because I need someone to fill an empty space in my life, but because you make me remember what it feels like to be genuinely happy. You make me want to be better than I am." Elena had said yes not because of the security he offered, not because of the dramatic change in circumstances that marriage would bring, but because she had discovered in Charles Blackwell a man who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. Someone who understood that strength could be quiet, that intelligence came in many forms, That dignity was not a luxury, but a birthright that everyone deserved to claim. The wedding had been small, held at City Hall with only the necessary witnesses present. Elena had worn a simple white dress that she had bought with her own money, had carried flowers from the corner bodega where her grandmother once worked, had felt her mother's presence like a blessing as she promised to love and honor a man who had shown her that fairy tales could sometimes happen to people who had never expected them. Tonight's dinner had been designed as Marcus's introduction to the woman who was about to become part of his family. Charles had thought it would be less overwhelming for his son to meet Elena in her professional capacity first, to see her competence and grace in action before the revelation of their relationship. It had seemed like a thoughtful approach, a way to let Marcus form his own opinions about Elena's character before those opinions could be colored by knowledge of her connection to his father. But Elena realized now that Charles had underestimated his son's capacity for casual cruelty, had perhaps forgotten that privilege could insulate people not only from consequences, but from the basic human empathy that made decent behavior possible. Marcus had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person Elena had encountered throughout her years in service. Someone who derived satisfaction from making others feel small, who confused politeness with weakness, who had never learned that true power came not from the ability to diminish others, but from the capacity to lift them up. As she stood in the dining room, watching Marcus's face cycle through shock, confusion, and something that might have been the first stirrings of shame, Elena felt not triumph, but a deep sadness for the opportunities that had been wasted, for the lessons that had been unlearned, for the human connections that Marcus had missed by viewing other people as objects rather than as equals. She thought of her mother, of the dignity with which Maria Martinez approached even the most menial work, of the way she had taught Elena to see service not as subservience, but as an opportunity to make other people's lives a little better. She thought of Chef Laurent's philosophy about becoming like water, essential but not overwhelming, present but not intrusive, powerful in its gentleness. Most of all, she thought about the man who saw past her uniform to the person beneath, who had chosen to love her not despite her background, but because of the strength and character that background had revealed to become. Charles Blackwell had given her many things: security, partnership, a future full of possibilities she had never imagined. But perhaps the greatest gift was the reminder that she was worthy of being loved exactly as she was. Now came the real work, teaching Marcus Blackwell that the same was true for everyone he encountered, regardless of their job title or bank balance. Elena suspected it would be the most challenging service she had ever provided, but also, perhaps the most important. The silence that followed Charles's announcement stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with tension that seemed to electrify the very air in the private dining room. Marcus's face had gone through several color changes, from pale shock to flushed anger to an ashen gray that made him look suddenly much younger than his 24 years. His friends sat frozen in their chairs, their education apparently having failed them to prepare for a situation where their social dynamics could shift so dramatically in a single moment. "You're joking," Marcus finally managed, his voice cracking slightly on the second word. "This is some kind of elaborate prank. You hired an actress, didn't you, to teach me some lesson about—" He gestured helplessly at Elena, who stood beside his father with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the evening's performance. "About what, exactly? Humility? Respect for the working class?" Charles's expression didn't change, but Elena felt the slight tightening of his hand around hers, the only outward sign of the disappointment she knew was flooding through him. "No joke, son. No lesson, no prank. Elena and I were married this morning in a private ceremony. James here served as one of our witnesses." He nodded toward the attorney, who opened his briefcase with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to dramatic revelations. "The marriage certificate," James Morrison said, withdrawing an official document that bore the seal of New York County. "Filed this morning at 10:47 a.m., completely legal and properly executed." He set it on the table like evidence in a trial, which, Elena realized, this essentially was. Marcus stared at the document as if it might burst into flames. But she's a waitress. He looked around the table desperately, seeking allies among his friends, but found only uncomfortable expressions and averted gazes. "Father, she's obviously after your money. This is textbook gold-digging behavior." "Actually," Elena said quietly, speaking for the first time since the revelation, "I insisted on a prenuptial agreement that ensures I received nothing from your father's estate beyond what I've earned through my own work. James can show you that document as well, if you'd like." The prenup appeared on the table beside the marriage certificate, its pages thick with legal language that boiled down to a simple premise. Elena Blackwell would leave the marriage with exactly what she brought into it, plus any income she earned independently during their time together. No claim to Blackwell Industries, no inheritance rights, no access to the vast fortune that Charles had built over 4 decades of relentless work. "I don't understand," Marcus said, and for the first time that evening, Elena heard something other than arrogance. Confusion, yes, but also something that might have been genuine bewilderment. "If you're not after his money, then why would you love him?" Elena finished gently. "Because your father is a good man, Marcus. Because he treats people with kindness and respect regardless of their station in life. Because he makes me laugh, challenges me intellectually, and supports my dreams instead of dismissing them. Because when he looks at me, he sees a partner, not a possession or a service provider." Sarah, the young woman who had mouthed an apology earlier, leaned forward slightly. "Marcus," she said softly, "maybe we should—" "No," Marcus snapped, his voice sharp enough to make several people flinch. "No, this is insane. Father, you've known her for what, a few months? And you married a waitress without even discussing it with your family?" "I've known Elena for 8 months, Charles corrected, his own voice maintaining the calm authority that had built his empire. "And she's not a waitress. She's a hospitality professional with advanced certifications, a woman who speaks 3 languages fluently, who has traveled extensively, who reads voraciously, and who runs the private events division for one of the most exclusive restaurants in Manhattan. But even if none of that were true, even if she were simply someone who served tables to make an honest living, that would still make her worthy of respect and consideration." "Worthy of respect, fine, but worthy of marriage? Worthy of joining our family? Do you have any idea what people will say, what the board will think, what this does to our reputation?" Elena watched Charles's jaw tighten, the first sign of real anger she had seen from him all evening. "Are you suggesting," he said, each word carefully measured, "that your primary concern about my marriage is how it affects our social standing?" "Yes," Marcus exclaimed, as if the answer were obvious. "Of course that's my concern. We have a position to maintain, responsibilities to our shareholders, obligations to the community. You can't just marry the help and expect everyone to pretend it's normal." The "marry the help" phrase hung in the air like poison gas. Elena felt the words hit her like physical blows, not because they wounded her sense of self-worth, but because they revealed the depths of Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding about human value. She thought of her grandmother, who had built a successful business from nothing, of her mother, who had sacrificed everything to give Elena opportunities, of Chef Laurent, whose hands had created art from simple ingredients, of the thousands of hard-working people she had encountered who made the world function through their dedication and skill. "The help," she repeated softly, her voice carrying a note that made everyone at the table look at her. "Is that what you think I am, Marcus? Help?" "Well, aren't you? You serve food, you take orders, you clean up after other people. That's exactly what help does." Elena nodded slowly, as if considering his perspective. "You're right about the mechanics of what I do. I serve food, take orders, and clean up. But let me ask you something. When you ordered that salmon earlier, do you remember exactly how you phrased the request? Marcus frowned. What does that have to do with anything? Humor me. I, I said I wanted it medium rare. Obviously. Actually, Elena said, her voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher explaining a difficult concept. What you said was, I'll have the salmon not overcooked like last time. You didn't specify a temperature. I asked Chef Laurent to prepare it medium rare because I remembered from your previous visits, yes, I remembered you, even though you've never remembered me, that you prefer fish slightly underdone. The salmon you rejected was prepared exactly to your usual preferences. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, clearly trying to recall the exact conversation. The steak you ordered afterward, I had prepared medium in instead of medium rare, because your body language suggested you were agitated and might perceive rare meat as undercooked regardless of how it was actually prepared. I was right. You ate every bite without complaint. That's not... How could you possibly... Because I'm good at my job, Marcus. Really good. I've spent years learning to read people, to anticipate needs, to solve problems before they become complaints. I've studied wine pairings with the same intensity that you studied business at Wharton. I've memorized the dietary restrictions and preferences of over 300 regular customers. I speak French well enough to communicate directly with our French suppliers, Italian well enough to discuss wine selections with our sommelier from Tuscany, and Spanish well enough to serve as translator when we host events for South American diplomats. She paused, letting the information settle. But more than that, I've learned to see people, really see them. I notice when someone is celebrating good news or drowning their sorrows. I remember anniversaries and birthdays. I know which customers are dealing with divorce proceedings and which ones just got engaged. I provide service not just with my hands, but with my heart and mind. Marcus stared at her, clearly struggling to reconcile this articulate, confident woman with the silent figure he had dismissed so casually earlier in the evening. The difference between us, Marcus, is not our intelligence or our education or our potential value to society. The difference is that I've learned to find dignity in honest work, while you've learned to find superiority in inherited privilege. Charles squeezed Elena's hand, his pride evident in the slight smile that softened his features. Elena, I think Marcus and his friends might benefit from understanding a bit more about your background, about the life you've built for yourself. Elena shook her head. Charles, that's not necessary. I don't need to justify my existence to anyone, including your son. But I'd like them to know, Charles said gently. I'd like Marcus to understand what kind of woman I fell in love with and why. Elena looked around the table, seeing the mixture of curiosity and discomfort on the faces of Marcus's friends. These were young people who had been raised in the same bubble of privilege, who had probably never questioned their assumptions about class and worth. Perhaps some of them could still be reached, still be taught to see beyond the boundaries of their narrow experience. She moved to stand behind one of the empty chairs, her posture straight and her voice clear. I came to New York 12 years ago with 2 suitcases and $800. I had dropped and insurance bureaucracies while working 3 jobs to keep us afloat financially. She paused, watching Marcus's face as she continued. When my mother died at 24, I could have given up. I could have returned to Washington Heights, found a simple job, lived a simple life. But she had made me promise to finish what I started, So I came here with nothing but determination and a letter of recommendation from the hospice nurse who had seen me advocate for my mother every single day for 2 years. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, perhaps beginning to recognize the strength it took to rebuild a life from such devastating loss. My first job was cleaning office buildings at night. Your father's building, actually, though we wouldn't meet for another 11 years. I scrubbed floors in the executive suites while studying for my GED during breaks. I saved every dollar I could, lived on ramen and day-old bagels, slept on a mattress on the floor of a studio apartment I shared with 2 other women. Elena's voice remained steady, matter-of-fact, as if recounting someone else's history rather than her own struggles. I earned my GED, then enrolled in community college part-time. It took me 6 years to complete a 2-year degree because I could only afford 1 or 2 classes per semester. But I graduated summa cum laude with an associate degree in hospitality management. Sarah leaned forward, clearly engaged despite the awkwardness of the situation. "That must have been incredibly difficult," she said softly. "It was," Elena acknowledged, "but it taught me something valuable, that education isn't just about sitting in classrooms. Every job I worked, every challenge I faced, every person I met was teaching me something. The office cleaning job taught me attention to detail and the importance of creating pleasant environments for others. The weekend catering gigs taught me how to work under pressure and coordinate with teams. The retail job taught me customer service and how to remain gracious even when people were having their worst days." Marcus remained silent, but Elena could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, perhaps for the first time really considering what it meant to build a life without the safety net he had always taken for granted. "When I finally got my first restaurant position, it was as a busser at a mid-level place in Midtown. I was 28 years old, clearing tables alongside kids fresh out of high school. But I watched everything, how the servers moved, how they interacted with customers, how they handled complaints and celebrations. I studied wine in my free time, practiced French with language exchange partners, read everything I could about hospitality and service." Charles watched his son's face carefully, seeing perhaps what Elena saw, the slow dawning of understanding, the recognition that the woman he had dismissed so casually had overcome obstacles that Marcus had never even imagined facing. "I earned my sommelier certification by studying after 16-hour shifts, taking the exam 3 times before I passed. I learned about art, literature, and music because I wanted to be able to connect with our diverse clientele. I traveled, using my vacation days and every spare dollar I had saved because I believed that understanding different cultures would make me better at my job." "But why?" Marcus asked suddenly, his voice smaller than it had been all evening. "Why not just find an easier path?" Elena smiled, and for the first time that evening, it was a smile of genuine warmth rather than professional courtesy. "Because, Marcus, I learned something from watching my mother die with dignity despite every hardship life threw at her, that we don't get to choose our circumstances, but we absolutely get to choose who we become because of them." She returned to Charles's side, taking his hand again. "Your father saw all of that, the journey, the determination, the refusal to be diminished by other people's assumptions. He didn't fall in love with my potential or my gratitude for being rescued. He fell in love with who I already was, who I had made myself into through years of choosing growth over bitterness." James Morrison, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, spoke up for the first time since producing the legal documents. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed decades of family dynamics in his legal practice. "I've known your father for 15 years, Marcus. I've never seen him happier or at more peace than he has been these past few months with Elena." Charles nodded, his eyes never leaving his son's face. "Elena makes me want to be better, Marcus. She challenges me to think beyond profit margins and stock prices, to consider the human impact of every decision I make. She's taught me that true wealth isn't measured in assets, but in the quality of your relationships and the positive impact you have on others' lives." But the age difference, Marcus said weakly, grasping for objections. The social implications. What will people think? People will think what they choose to think, Elena replied calmly. Those whose opinions matter, people who value character over credentials, substance over superficiality, will judge us by how we treat each other and how we contribute to the world around us. Those whose opinions are based on prejudice and narrow-mindedness were never going to approve of anything that challenged their worldview anyway. She looked directly at Marcus, her gaze steady and uncompromising. The real question, Marcus, is what you're going to think. Are you going to let this evening be the beginning of a better relationship with your father and a chance to expand your understanding of what makes people valuable? Or are you going to let your pride and preconceptions prevent you from accepting a woman who loves your father and wants nothing more than to be part of a family that treats each other with respect and kindness? The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet of earlier revelations. This was the pause of consideration, of a young man confronting the uncomfortable reality that his worldview might be both limited and limiting. Sarah cleared her throat gently. Marcus, she said, I think maybe this is exactly the kind of person your father should be with. Someone who understands what it means to work for everything you have. Someone who values people for who they are rather than what they own. One of Marcus's other friends, a young man who had remained silent throughout the evening, nodded in agreement. My grandmother came from nothing. She cleaned houses to put my grandfather through medical school. She was the strongest, wisest person I ever knew. If someone had judged her the way He trailed off, the implication clear. Marcus looked around the table, seeing perhaps for the first time that his assumptions weren't shared by everyone in his circle, that his casual cruelty had been noticed and disapproved of even by those who had remained silent. Elena watched the internal struggle playing out across his features and made a decision that surprised even herself. Marcus, I know this is a lot to process. I don't expect you to welcome me with open arms immediately, and I don't need you to pretend everything is fine, but I hope, in time, you'll give me a chance to show you that I'm not trying to replace anyone or change anything about your relationship with your father. I'm just trying to add something positive to both of your lives. She paused, then continued with the kind of vulnerability that could only come from someone who had learned that strength and openness weren't mutually exclusive. I lost my mother when I was 26. I know what it's like to feel like the family structure you've always known is changing in ways you can't control. If you'll let me, I'd like to be someone you can talk to about that. Someone who understands that loving your father doesn't mean trying to replace the mother you lost. For the first time all evening, Marcus's composure cracked completely. His eyes filled with tears he had been holding back for 3 years, grief and confusion and fear all mixing together in a display of emotion that reminded everyone present that beneath his arrogance and entitlement was still a young man who had lost his mother and been struggling to understand his place in a changed world. I just started, then stopped, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I just miss her so much. And father seemed fine, seemed like he was moving on without any trouble, and I couldn't understand how he could just replace her. Charles moved around the table to his son, pulling him into the kind of embrace they hadn't shared in years. "Oh, Marcus," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "I'm not replacing your mother. No one could ever replace her. But she wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone. And she definitely wouldn't want you to carry this anger and pain by yourself. Your mother raised you to be better than what you showed tonight," Elena added gently. "I may not have known her personally, but any woman who raised a son your father loves so deeply must have been extraordinary. I'm not trying to take her place. I'm just hoping to honor her memory by loving the family she left behind." The transformation in Marcus wasn't instant. Decades of privilege and months of resentment couldn't be undone in a single evening, but something shifted in his posture, in the way he looked at Elena, in the recognition that his pain didn't justify causing pain to others. "I'm sorry," he said finally, looking directly at Elena for the first time all evening. "I was horrible to you tonight. Inexcusably horrible. Even if you weren't, even if you were just a server, that behavior was unacceptable. Apology accepted, Elena replied simply. But more importantly, what are you going to do differently moving forward? Marcus managed a shaky laugh. I guess I need to learn how to see people the way you and Father do, as individuals worthy of respect rather than just background characters in my own story. That's exactly right, Charles, he said, pride evident in his voice. And Elena can teach you that if you'll let her. She's had years of practice seeing the best in people even when they don't show it to her initially. As the evening wound down, the dynamics around the table had shifted completely. What had begun as Marcus's performance of casual cruelty had transformed into a genuine conversation about family, loss, growth, and the courage required to change long-held assumptions about ourselves and others. Elena knew the real work was just beginning, that building a relationship with Marcus would take time, patience, and probably more than a few setbacks. But as she watched him genuinely engage with his father for the first time in months, as she saw him treating Marie with actual courtesy when she returned to clear the table, as she witnessed the small but significant steps toward becoming the man his mother had raised him to be, Elena felt hopeful. The lesson of the evening wasn't about a server getting revenge on a rude customer or about a gold digger revealing her true motives. It was about the transformative power of seeing people clearly, of recognizing that everyone, regardless of their job title, bank balance, or background, carries within them both the capacity for growth and the fundamental right to be treated with dignity. As Elena Blackwell walked out of Le Bernardin that night, her arm linked with her husband's and her stepson walking thoughtfully beside them, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the most important service we can provide is simply showing others that it's never too late to become better than we were. That was an incredible journey of transformation and unexpected twists. If this story moved you and you want to see more amazing tales like this, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe for more incredible stories that will restore your faith in human nature.